Is this a courtroom or a circus? The opposing attorney said as laughter echoed across the chamber when the janitor stepped forward to represent the old man. The sound carried through the polished wood room of Suffolk County Courthouse in Boston, bouncing off the high ceilings and brass light fixtures, lingering just a second too long. Eleanor Whitmore did not flinch. She stood at the defense table in a Navy maintenance uniform, her gray hair pulled neatly into a low bun, her hands steady as she placed a worn leather folder on the surface in front of her. Across from her sat Harold Bennett, 82 years old, shoulders slightly bent with age but eyes sharp and alert. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at her. In the gallery, reporters leaned forward, whispering to one another. A few spectators smirked openly. The headline had already begun to spread through local news feeds that morning. Elderly businessman trusts janitor to defend him in property dispute. To most of them, it sounded like a desperate move from a man who had lost his judgment. Richard Collins, a polished attorney in a tailored charcoal suit, adjusted his cufflinks and gave a thin smile. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "I assume we'll be proceeding once proper counsel arrives." Another ripple of laughter drifted through the room. Judge Margaret Lawson raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Eleanor simply opened her folder. Inside were neatly tabbed documents, copies of bank statements, notarized records, and a printed copy of Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 190B. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and even. "Your Honor, Mr. Bennett has authorized me to speak on his behalf." No tremor, no hesitation. The courtroom quieted slightly, though the disbelief remained. Collins shook his head lightly, as if indulging a child. "With respect, this is a complex financial matter involving multiple trust accounts and real estate transfers exceeding $2 million. Surely this is not the time for theatrics." Eleanor looked directly at him for the first time. There was no anger in her expression, only a measured stillness. "This is not theater, Mr. Collins," she replied. "This is documentation." Harold shifted in his seat, folding his hands over his cane. The accusation against him was simple on paper, that he had unlawfully redirected ownership of a lakeside property and several investment accounts away from his grandson. The narrative painted him as confused, perhaps manipulated, no longer capable of managing his own affairs. It was a story that fit neatly into assumptions about age. It was also a story that relied heavily on one document, a power of attorney signed 18 months prior. Collins began outlining the case with confident pacing, describing signatures, dates, and account movements in crisp legal language that impressed the spectators. Eleanor did not interrupt. She took notes. She listened. The earlier laughter faded into murmurs. When Collins finished, he sat back with quiet satisfaction. All eyes turned to the woman in the janitor's uniform. Eleanor closed her pen, stood, and approached the lectern without rushing. The courtroom seemed to lean forward collectively, waiting for her to stumble. Instead, she asked her first question, her tone almost gentle. "Mr. Collins, could you clarify who scheduled the notary appointment for the power of attorney dated March 12th? The room grew still. The question was precise. It was not defensive. It was surgical. And for the first time that morning, Richard Collins did not smile. Richard Collins hesitated for only a fraction of a second before answering, but the pause did not go unnoticed. He adjusted the stack of papers in front of him and replied that the appointment had been arranged through the grandson's office, as a convenience to ensure that all documentation was handled efficiently. Eleanor nodded once, as if confirming something she already knew. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she stepped closer to the lectern and continued in the same measured tone, asking whether Mr. Bennett had personally requested that specific notary or whether the selection had been made on his behalf. Collins responded that the grandson had coordinated the logistics due to Mr. Bennett's limited mobility at the time. A quiet murmur spread across the gallery. Eleanor turned slightly, glancing at Harold Bennett, who sat upright now, his hands no longer folded but resting firmly on the table. The frailty that had defined the earlier narrative seemed less convincing under the bright courtroom lights. Eleanor then directed the court's attention to the signature on the power of attorney. She requested that the document be displayed on the overhead screen. The enlarged image filled the wall behind the judge's bench, revealing every curve and angle of the handwriting. "Would you agree?" she asked Collins evenly. that this signature differs in slant and pressure from the signatures on Mr. Bennett's banking records from the prior decade. Collins shifted slightly, stating that variations in handwriting are common among elderly individuals. Eleanor did not disagree. She simply retrieved another document from her folder, this one a certified statement from a handwriting analyst based in Cambridge. She handed a copy to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The courtroom, once restless with amusement, grew noticeably still. Eleanor explained that the analyst had compared 20 authenticated signatures from Mr. Bennett over a 15-year span with the one attached to the contested power of attorney. The conclusion had not been dramatic. It had been precise. The stroke sequence differed. The pressure points were inconsistent. The signature on the power of attorney appeared to have been slowly traced rather than fluidly written. Collins objected, suggesting that the analysis was speculative. Eleanor acknowledged the objection respectfully and moved to her next point without defensiveness. She asked whether any independent legal counsel had been present when Mr. Bennett signed the document. Collins admitted that there had not been separate representation at that meeting. A faint tightening appeared around Judge Lawson's eyes. Eleanor continued by presenting time-stamped security footage from the bank lobby on the date in question, showing that Mr. Bennett had arrived nearly 40 minutes after the notary session had officially begun. The implications settled over the courtroom like a slow-moving shadow. Eleanor did not accuse anyone directly. She simply arranged the facts in sequence, each detail placed carefully beside the next. The earlier laughter felt distant now, replaced by the quiet recognition that the woman in the maintenance uniform understood the case with deliberate clarity. When she finally stepped back from the lectern, the silence in the room was no longer disbelief. It was attention. Richard Collins attempted to regain control of the room by stepping forward and speaking with renewed confidence, suggesting that minor inconsistencies in paperwork did not overturn the broader financial record, but the earlier ease in his voice had thinned. Eleanor Whitmore did not challenge his tone. She allowed the weight of the projected documents to linger before introducing the next piece of evidence. She asked the court to review the transaction timeline for the investment accounts tied to the lakeside property. On the surface, the transfers appeared orderly, spaced over several months, each approved, under the authority of the power of attorney. However, when Eleanor highlighted the dates beside the corresponding medical records of Harold Bennett, a pattern began to surface. On 3 separate occasions when substantial sums were redirected, Mr. Bennett had been documented as attending routine medical appointments across town, each visit lasting less than 1 hour. The signatures authorizing the transfers were time-stamped during those same windows. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Eleanor did not accuse. She simply placed the timeline beside the facts and stepped back. Judge Margaret Lawson leaned forward slightly, examining the chart displayed on the screen. Collins argued that electronic authorizations could be processed remotely and that such overlap was not unusual. Eleanor acknowledged that possibility and then produced printed email correspondence obtained through a lawful records request. The messages were brief exchanges between the grandson and a financial advisor, discussing urgency and discretion. One line in particular drew the judge's attention. Grandfather does not need to be bothered with the details. Eleanor read the sentence aloud without emphasis. It did not require dramatization. The words carried their own weight. In the gallery, the earlier whispers had vanished entirely. Reporters who had once prepared light-hearted headlines now typed with measured focus. Harold Bennett watched the proceedings with a steady gaze, no longer appearing confused or diminished, but quietly resolute. Eleanor then asked a final question, her voice calm and unhurried. She requested confirmation of whether Mr. Bennett had ever been formally evaluated as incapable of managing his own financial affairs. Collins conceded that no such evaluation had been conducted and that the power of attorney had been executed as a precaution rather than a necessity. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier pause. It was not skepticism. It was recalibration. The narrative of an elderly man losing control of his estate began to unravel under the steady rhythm of documented fact. Eleanor returned to her seat without flourish, folding her hands over the closed leather folder. She did not look toward the gallery. She did not look toward the cameras. She looked only at the judge, waiting. The room no longer saw a janitor standing beside an old man. It saw a sequence of details assembled with deliberate precision, each one quietly reshaping the story that had once seemed so certain. Judge Margaret Lawson folded her hands on the bench and looked down at the documents spread before her, her expression composed but no longer indifferent. The confidence that had filled the room at the beginning of the hearing had thinned into careful attention. Richard Collins cleared his throat and requested permission to redirect the focus toward what he described as the broader intention behind the power of attorney. He suggested that families often act out of concern and that precautionary measures can be misunderstood in hindsight. Eleanor Whitmore listened without interruption. When the judge invited her to respond, she did not stand immediately. She allowed a brief silence to settle, as if measuring the weight of what needed to be said. Then she rose and approached the lectern once more. Her voice remained steady, almost conversational. She stated that intention can be honorable, but execution must be transparent. She directed the court to a final set of records, this time from the Registry of Deeds. The lakeside property in question had been appraised at approximately $1.8 million 6 months prior to the disputed transfer. Within 30 days of the power of attorney being signed, preliminary inquiries had been made by a development firm regarding subdivision potential. Eleanor did not imply wrongdoing. She simply placed the appraisal beside the inquiry timeline. The sequence spoke for itself. Harold Bennett watched quietly, his jaw set but his posture calm. He had built his small manufacturing business over 4 decades, had paid off his mortgage before his 70th birthday, and had purchased the lakeside property as a retirement dream rather than a financial strategy. The suggestion that he had been incapable of understanding his own decisions now seemed increasingly strained. Eleanor then addressed the question that had hovered unspoken over the entire proceeding. She asked whether Mr. Bennett had ever expressed a desire to sell or subdivide the property. Collins admitted that no written statement of such intent existed. Eleanor nodded once. She did not press further. Instead, she read a brief excerpt from a letter Harold had written to his grandson 2 years earlier, describing the lake house as a place for family gatherings, a refuge for future generations, a reminder of hard-earned stability. The words were simple and unadorned. They did not sound like the language of a man detached from his affairs. As she finished reading, Eleanor closed the folder gently and rested her palms on the lectern. She stated that capacity is not measured by age alone, and trust is not transferred through convenience. The courtroom remained still. There was no laughter now, no whispering commentary from the back rows. Judge Lawson adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Collins, asking whether there was any independent verification that Mr. Bennett had been fully informed of the development inquiries at the time the power of attorney was executed. Collins hesitated before admitting that there was none. The silence that followed felt decisive. Eleanor stepped back from the lectern once more, her expression unchanged. She had not raised her voice. She had not accused anyone of deception. She had simply aligned documents, timelines, and written words in a way that made the earlier assumptions difficult to sustain. In that quiet courtroom, the narrative of frailty had given way to something else entirely. The recognition that clarity does not require volume, and credibility does not depend on a uniform. The stillness in the courtroom held as Judge Margaret Lawson leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression thoughtful rather than skeptical. Richard Collins shuffled through his notes once more, but the crisp certainty that had defined his earlier presentation had softened into careful calculation. Eleanor Whitmore remained standing for a moment longer, then returned to her place beside Harold Bennett. She did not whisper reassurance. She did not dramatize the moment. Harold nodded once in quiet acknowledgement, his confidence in her unspoken but unmistakable. After a brief pause, Judge Lawson asked whether there were any additional clarifications before she recessed to review the evidence. Collins rose again and attempted to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding fueled by generational differences and informal family arrangements. He suggested that even if procedural missteps had occurred, they did not automatically imply deliberate misrepresentation. Eleanor listened without interruption, her posture composed. When invited to respond, she stood once more and spoke in the same calm, measured cadence. She stated that misunderstandings can be resolved through transparency, but concealment leaves a record. She directed attention to one final exhibit, a certified letter sent by Harold Bennett 3 weeks after the power of attorney was executed. In that letter, he requested detailed explanations of recent account changes and property inquiries. The letter had gone unanswered for over 30 days. Eleanor did not assign motive. She simply read the date, the request, and the absence of response. The omission hung in the air longer than any accusation could have. In the gallery, a reporter lowered her pen slowly, as if realizing that the story unfolding was not about spectacle but about overlooked details. Harold sat straighter now, the narrative of confusion no longer fitting the man visible before the court. Judge Lawson asked Collins whether there was documentation showing that the requested explanations had been provided. Collins admitted that there was no formal reply on record. The judge nodded once, her expression steady. Eleanor closed her folder carefully and rested her hands at her sides. She had not raised her voice throughout the proceeding. She had not attempted to embarrass anyone. She had simply placed documents in order, each one reinforcing the next. The earlier laughter seemed distant and almost out of place in memory. What remained was a quiet clarity. Judge Lawson announced that she would take a brief recess to examine the submitted materials before delivering a preliminary determination. As the gavel tapped lightly against the wood, the courtroom exhaled in unison. Spectators who had entered expecting a display of misplaced confidence now watched Eleanor with measured respect. She remained composed, her maintenance uniform unchanged, her demeanor unshaken. The shift had not occurred through confrontation. It had occurred through consistency. And in that quiet pause before the ruling, it was clear that the room no longer saw a janitor defending an old man. It saw the careful unraveling of an assumption that had once seemed unquestionable. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt narrower than it had that morning, as if the walls themselves had shifted to accommodate a different reality. Reporters gathered near the double doors, microphones lowered but ready, their earlier expressions of amusement replaced by measured restraint. Harold Bennett paused for a moment near a marble column, adjusting his grip on his cane. He looked tired, but not diminished. Eleanor Whitmore stood beside him, her leather folder tucked neatly under her arm, her maintenance badge still clipped to her uniform. She did not step forward to address the cameras. She waited. A young reporter finally spoke, asking whether she had formal legal training. The question carried no mockery now, only curiosity. Eleanor regarded her calmly and answered in a voice that carried without strain. She explained that decades earlier she had completed 3 years of law school before life required a different path. She had worked nights cleaning courtrooms and days studying case law on her own. She had never taken the bar examination, but she had never stopped learning the structure of the system she maintained each evening. The hallway grew quiet. Harold glanced at her with something close to pride. Another reporter asked why she chose to step forward in this particular case. Eleanor replied that she had known Mr. Bennett for years through the courthouse corridors. She had watched him attend hearings regarding his small business, always prepared, always attentive. When she heard that he was being described as confused and incapable, the description did not align with the man she knew. She did not accuse anyone of exaggeration. She simply said that facts deserve alignment with truth. Across the hall, Richard Collins spoke quietly with his client, their conversation subdued. The confidence that once radiated from his posture had narrowed into careful professionalism. The temporary restoration of Harold's authority had altered the stakes. The upcoming forensic audit would unfold under closer scrutiny than anyone had anticipated. Harold finally spoke, his voice steady despite the long morning. He stated that he had trusted his family with good intentions, but trust should not replace clarity. He thanked Eleanor without flourish, describing her not as a savior, but as someone who paid attention when others did not. Eleanor inclined her head slightly, deflecting any suggestion of heroism. She explained that documents speak when they are arranged correctly. As they began walking toward the courthouse exit, several bystanders stepped aside instinctively. The earlier laughter from hours before felt almost surreal in contrast to the present stillness. Sunlight filtered through the glass doors as they stepped outside onto the wide granite steps. The city moved around them in ordinary rhythm, taxis passing, pedestrians crossing at the light, unaware of the subtle shift that had just taken place inside. Eleanor paused briefly at the top step, looking out over the street. The uniform she wore remained unchanged, but the assumptions attached to it had dissolved. She adjusted the folder under her arm and continued down the steps beside Harold, not seeking recognition, not seeking applause, simply returning to the quiet steadiness that had carried her through the day. The next morning, the courthouse felt different, though nothing about its granite facade or polished floors had changed. News of the suspended transfers and the forthcoming forensic audit had traveled quickly through Boston's legal circles. Inside her small apartment less than 5 miles from downtown, Eleanor Whitmore sat at a narrow kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a neatly folded newspaper. Harold Bennett's name appeared in a modest column on page 3, not sensationalized, not mocked, simply described as a business owner disputing asset control. Eleanor read the article once, then set it aside. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only focus. Later that afternoon, she returned to the courthouse in the same Navy uniform, pushing her maintenance cart down the familiar corridor lined with framed portraits of past judges. The building hummed with routine motion. Clerks carried folders between offices. Attorneys spoke in low tones near the elevators. Some of them glanced at her differently now, not with laughter, with recognition. She did not pause to acknowledge it. She wiped down the wooden benches outside courtroom 4 with the same deliberate care she had shown the day before at the lectern. Precision, in her mind, did not belong only to legal argument. It belonged to consistency. Meanwhile, Harold met with a financial auditor recommended by the court. The meeting took place in a modest conference room overlooking the Charles River. Stacks of statements and digital records were reviewed line by line. The numbers began to tell a story that aligned closely with the timeline Eleanor had quietly assembled. Transfers had clustered around specific windows. Authorization requests had originated from a single device. The auditor documented each anomaly with professional restraint. There was no drama in the process, only methodical clarity. By early evening, Harold called Eleanor. His voice carried relief, but also a trace of introspection. He admitted that he had trusted convenience more than caution. Eleanor listened without judgment. She told him that trust is honorable, but oversight protects it. She did not elevate herself. She did not claim foresight. She simply reaffirmed that documentation has a memory, even when people prefer not to. The forensic review would take several weeks to complete, but its trajectory already suggested that the narrative presented at the hearing would not hold under scrutiny. As the sun set over the city skyline, Eleanor finished her shift and walked out of the courthouse through the same glass doors she had exited the day before. The evening air was cool, carrying the distant sound of traffic and harbor wind. She adjusted the strap of her worn leather folder, now resting empty under her arm. The uniform she wore still marked her occupation, but it no longer defined the assumptions attached to it. Inside the courthouse, the echo of laughter from that first morning had faded entirely, replaced by something quieter and more enduring. The recognition that authority does not always announce itself with credentials displayed. Sometimes it stands quietly at a lectern, arranges facts without anger, and allows the truth to shift the room on its own. 3 weeks later the courtroom filled again, not with laughter this time, but with restrained attention as the forensic audit findings were formally presented before Judge Margaret Lawson. The report, prepared by an independent financial examiner appointed by the court, outlined a clear pattern of unauthorized digital authorizations initiated from a private device registered to Harold Bennett's grandson. The timestamps corresponded precisely with the transaction windows Eleanor Whitmore had previously highlighted. There was no dramatic language in the report, only numbers, dates, and authenticated access logs. Judge Lawson reviewed the summary quietly before addressing the parties. She stated that the evidence demonstrated that the power of attorney had been improperly executed and subsequently leveraged without full disclosure to Mr. Bennett. The court therefore declared the document void and reinstated all disputed property rights and account controls to Harold effective immediately. A low murmur moved through the gallery, not of shock but of acknowledgement. Richard Collins remained professional, nodding slightly as he absorbed the ruling. There was no spectacle in his reaction, only the recognition that the documentation left little room for counterargument. Harold Bennett sat upright, his expression composed rather than triumphant. He had not sought victory. He had sought clarity. Eleanor Whitmore stood beside him in the same Navy uniform she had worn since the first hearing. When Judge Lawson concluded the session, She paused briefly and looked toward Eleanor. She did not comment on attire or background. She simply acknowledged that the court appreciates diligence grounded in fact. The gavel sounded lightly, sealing the decision. Outside the courtroom, there were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures. Harold extended his hand to Eleanor, his grip firm. He thanked her again, this time not only for the defense, but for the reminder that attention to detail protects dignity. Eleanor accepted the gesture with a slight nod. She told him that systems function best when people read what they sign and question what they do not understand. That afternoon, Harold met with a licensed attorney to formalize revised estate documents under transparent conditions. He chose independent oversight and clear communication moving forward. Eleanor returned to her maintenance duties before the building closed for the day. She wiped the same wooden benches and emptied the same waste bin she had tended for years. Yet the corridor felt different. Colleagues greeted her with quiet respect. No one mentioned the laughter from weeks earlier. It no longer belonged to the present. As evening settled over Boston, Eleanor stepped outside onto the granite steps once more. The city lights reflected against the glass facade of the courthouse. She adjusted the strap of her worn leather folder, now containing nothing more than neatly filed copies of the concluded case. She did not seek recognition. She did not linger for praise. The shift had never been about applause. It had been about alignment. In that quiet closing moment, the lesson remained simple and steady. Authority does not always announce itself through titles or tailored suits. Sometimes it stands patiently in a uniform, arranges the truth in order, and allows facts to speak until even a crowded courtroom learns to listen.